They called her the Rock Woman. They saw a civilian with hands too clean for the grit of the outpost and a voice too quiet for the constant wind that scoured the valley. They saw her leave the wire with a geologist's hammer and return with stones that she treated like scripture. So they dismissed her. And then the mountain began to scream, the sky began to fall, and the only person who could interpret its language of ruin was the woman they had already cast out. By the time they learned her true name, it was no longer a name, but a legend being whispered into the smoking foundations of their certainty. FOB Razorback was a wound in the earth. It had been carved out of the hostile geology of the Zagramos spine, a temporary infection of steel and concrete meant to monitor a contested border that was less a line on a map and more a tectonic inevitability. The mountains were knives of shattered gneiss and hostile granite, eternally grinding against one another. The air was thin and tasted of cold metal and ancient dust. A perpetual wind, born in the high, dead peaks, moaned through the gaps in the Hesco barriers, a constant, low-grade psychological assault. It was a place that eroded more than just rock. It wore down certainty, patience, and hope. Silence here was not an absence of sound, but a coiled thing, a presence defined by the groan of stressed metal and the distant, percussive fall of stones shaken loose by forces no one could see. The men and women stationed there had adapted by becoming louder, their camaraderie a desperate bulwark against the oppressive quiet and the gnawing sense of being watched by the peaks themselves. Dr. Eris Thorne moved through this environment like a ghost, a creature of a different density. To the soldiers of Razorback, she was an anomaly, a civilian contractor attached to the post for reasons no one quite understood. Her official designation was senior geophysicist. Her task was to monitor the region's unusually volatile seismic activity. She spent her days in a small, repurposed storage container filled with humming servers and screens that displayed cascading lines of data, waveforms, thermal readings, stratum-penetrating radar scans. She would sit for hours, her focus absolute, a single finger tracing a line of code or the jagged peak of a seismograph reading. Her stillness was an affront to the nervous energy of the base. When she wasn't in her lab, she was outside the wire, accompanied by a reluctant fire team collecting rock samples. She would kneel on the scree slope, her gaze fixed on a fissure in a granite outcrop, her expression as remote and unreadable as the stone itself. She didn't participate in the mess hall banter. She didn't drink the bitter, boiled coffee. She existed on a different plane of purpose, one that was invisible to the men around her. Her appearance was one of deliberate neutrality, worn cargo pants, a plain gray thermal shirt, sturdy boots. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There was no rank on her collar, no insignia on her sleeves, nothing to anchor her in their familiar hierarchy. She was simply the geologist, a piece of equipment they didn't know how to use. Major Kalen Vance was the antithesis of this quiet. He was the commander of FOB Razorback, and he ruled it with his voice. It was a blunt instrument, a tool he used to hammer the world into a shape he understood. He was a man carved from regulation, his posture ramrod straight, his uniform starched to the point of being a weapon, his jaw perpetually tight with the effort of holding his small world together through sheer force of will. He saw the world in clean lines, friend and foe, order and chaos, rank and subordination. Ambiguity was a personal insult. Dr. Thorne was the embodiment of that ambiguity. He saw her not as an asset, but as a liability, a soft variable in a hard equation. Her quiet analysis was academic frippery in a world that responded only to the percussive arguments of a 50 caliber machine gun. He made his displeasure known not with direct confrontation, at first, but with a performance of dismissal. He would stride through the command center, his boots loud on the steel deck plates, and his eyes would slide over her as if she were a piece of furniture. His orders to his men would be just a little louder when she was near, a territorial display meant to remind everyone, including her, who commanded this space. The friction was inevitable, a grinding of plates as predictable as the geology around them. It happened in the heart of the base, the Combat Information Center. The CIC was a cavern of flickering screens and low, urgent voices, the nerve center where the raw data of survival was processed. Eris stood before the main holotable, her hand extended, manipulating a translucent, three-dimensional map of the valley. The map was overlaid with a complex web of pulsing red and blue lines that represented subterranean stress fields. The duty officers gave her a wide berth, unsure what she was doing, but unwilling to challenge the quiet intensity that surrounded her. She was tracking a cascade failure. The microfracturing in the granite substrate had not just increased, it was propagating, forming a network of fissures that was destabilizing the entire western face of the valley. The isostatic rebound from the last major tectonic shift, centuries ago, was accelerating at a logarithmic rate. The mountain was becoming unglued from the inside out. Vance entered the CIC like a weather front. The low hum of activity faltered, the operators straightening in their chairs. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging his domain, and then they locked onto the civilian at the heart of it. He strode toward the holotable, his boots a drumbeat of approaching authority. "Dr. Thorne," he said. The title was a blade. "This is a tactical operations center, not a university lecture hall. What, precisely, do you think you are doing?" Eris did not turn immediately. Her fingers completed a command, isolating a specific frequency of ground vibration that worried her. It was too rhythmic, too consistent to be natural. It was a hum, deep and resonant, a pure tone in a symphony of geological noise. Only then did she retract her hand and face him. Her expression was neutral, her gaze direct. "I am monitoring the structural integrity of this valley, Major. It is my designated function." "Your function," Vance sneered, the word heavy with contempt, "is to provide a weekly report. Your function is not to play with my tactical displays during active watch hours. This space is for soldiers, for warriors, not for rock collectors." The last words were aimed at the junior officers watching, a public assertion of his worldview. Eris's composure was absolute. It was this unnerving calm that infuriated him the most. It was as if his anger, his very presence, was just more data for her to analyze. "Major," she stated, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "the harmonic resonance in the C3 sector has synchronized into a coherent waveform. Subsurface vibrational stress has increased by 400% in the last 3 hours. The shale layer at 100 meters is approaching its liquefaction threshold. This mountain is not stable." The technical jargon was a wall he couldn't breach. He didn't understand liquefaction thresholds or harmonic waveforms, and he hated her for it. It made him feel stupid in his own command center. He saw it as a deliberate attempt to obfuscate, to challenge him with a language he didn't speak. He chose to interpret it as insubordination. "I don't speak gibberish, Doctor," he snapped. "I speak threats and responses. And the only threat I see in this room is a civilian wasting my time, and distracting my men with academic fantasies. The mountains have been here for 1,000,000 years. They'll be here for 1,000,000 more. I am more concerned with the enemy combatants on the other side of that ridge. They may be the same threat, Eris said quietly. That was the final straw. The suggestion was so far outside his tactical paradigm that it registered as pure insolence. "That's it," he barked, his face flushing with anger. "You're done, Sergeant," he yelled at the nearest NCO. "Escort Dr. Thorne to her quarters. She is confined. I want her on the first logistics flight out of here. I don't care if it's a resupply chopper or a drone. I want her gone. Get this woman out of my CIC." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "To the room at large," he announced. "Back to work. I want all eyes on the Eastern Pass." Eris said nothing. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of submission, but of acknowledgement. She had presented the data. The data had been rejected. The outcome was now a predictable variable in a new equation. The sergeant, a young man with nervous eyes, gestured awkwardly. "Ma'am, if you'll come with me." She followed him out of the CIC, her stride unhurried, her back as straight and unyielding as the major's. As she left, she heard Vance mutter to his executive officer, loud enough for her to hear, "Get lost, woman. Go play with your pebbles." The doors hissed shut behind her, sealing her out, sealing them in with their ignorance. Her quarters were a small, featureless box, another repurposed shipping container. The single window looked out not at the mountains, but at the back of the mess hall. They had taken her terminal, her link to the base's sensor network. They had cut her off. She was blind. She stood in the center of the room, not pacing, not sitting, simply standing. She closed her eyes. She didn't need the sensors. She could feel it. The vibration was no longer just a reading on a screen. It was a physical presence. It was a low, thrumming hum that traveled through the concrete floor, through the soles of her boots and into her bones. It was the feeling of a tuning fork pressed against her skeleton. She began to count, her lips barely moving, marking the interval between the pulses. It was a perfect, repeating pattern, artificial, deliberate. They were tuning the valley. Her analysis in the CIC had been incomplete. She had assumed the resonance was a precursor, a side effect of some other weapon being prepared. She was wrong. The resonance was the weapon. The first impact was not a sound, but a concussion. The air in her small room compressed, punching her in the chest. A deep, grinding roar followed, the sound of a god clearing his throat. The lights flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The emergency power kicked in a second later, casting the room in a hellish red glow. The floor bucked, throwing her against the wall. It was not the shudder of an earthquake. It was the violent, shearing motion of a stratum collapse. The enemy wasn't attacking the base with mortars or rockets. They were dismantling the ground beneath it. In the CIC, it was chaos. The main holotable went dark. Screens on the periphery showed static, or worse, live feeds of perimeter cameras being consumed by tides of rock and earth. The northern watchtower, a 50-foot pillar of steel and sensors, simply vanished from the tactical display, its icon blinking out of existence. A sound like 1,000 freight trains derailing at once filled the air, a physical pressure that made ears bleed. "Report!" Vance screamed, his voice raw with shock and fury. "What was that? Mortar fire? I want a target package for counter battery now." "Negative, sir," a panicked voice shouted from the sensor station. "No inbound trajectory, all seismic. The whole west wall of the valley is coming down." "Then shoot at it," Vance roared, his response primal. nonsensical. Get the heavy guns online, suppressing fire on the slope. Sir, we can't. The emplacements are buried. Tower 4 is gone. Tower 5 is offline. Vance stood frozen in the center of the room, his rigid certainty shattering like glass. The textbook had no chapter for this. His entire career had been spent fighting men, not geology. He tried to issue another order, but the words wouldn't come. The grinding roar intensified, and the CIC itself groaned, the metal plates of the ceiling visibly bowing downwards. Dust and debris rained down. Men were shouting, some were praying. The clean lines of his world had dissolved into a maelstrom of noise and terror. His authority, built on the bedrock of protocol, was useless now that the bedrock itself was turning to liquid. It was Sergeant Eva Rostova who broke. She was a comms technician, a quiet, efficient woman who had watched the earlier confrontation between Vance and Thorne with a troubled expression. She respected rank, but she revered competence, and she had seen the look in the geologist's eyes. It wasn't fantasy, it was certainty. While Vance was screaming for men to shoot at a landslide, Rostova's mind was replaying Thorne's words: harmonic resonance, liquefaction threshold. It was the only explanation that made sense. She made a decision. It was an act of career suicide, an act of outright insubordination that could land her in a military prison. But it was also the only logical move left. She turned from her console, her face set. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the din with surprising force. Vance didn't even hear her. She didn't wait for permission. She ran. She sprinted through the red-lit corridors, the deck heaving beneath her feet. Alarms blared, a pointless mechanical scream. She reached Thorne's container, hammered the emergency release panel, and wrenched the door open. Eris Thorne stood in the center of the room, unmoved by the chaos, her head tilted as if listening to a distant conversation. She wasn't surprised to see Rostova. She seemed to have been expecting her. "They're using phased sonic emitters," Eris said, her voice a calm island in the storm. There was no, "I told you so." There was no recrimination. There was only the problem. They've found the valley's primary resonant frequency. They're not just causing landslides. They're preparing a full stratum cascade. In approximately 90 seconds, the shale layer beneath this entire facility will liquefy. The base will sink into the mountain. Rostova stared at her, the sheer, terrifying simplicity of the statement washing over her. "What do we do?" she asked, the question a plea. "Take me to the CIC," Eris commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an order. They arrived back in the CIC to a scene of terminal collapse. A massive fissure had opened in the floor, and Major Vance was standing near its edge, yelling orders at men who were no longer listening. He saw Eris enter, flanked by Rostova, and a new kind of fury ignited in his eyes. The rage of a king whose authority is being usurped in his own throne room. "Sergeant Rostova, you are under arrest," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "And I told you to get this woman out of here!" Eris ignored him completely. Her eyes were already scanning the room, her mind a high-speed processor, cataloging assets and calculating probabilities. Most of the systems were down, but a secondary power conduit was still live, feeding a handful of auxiliary terminals. The base's deep stratum seismic sensors, her sensors, were on a dedicated, hardened network. They were still active. Their emitters were still functional. She moved to Rostova's station, her movements economical and precise. "Patch my terminal into the seismic emitter array's power grid and broadcast controls," she said, her voice low, but carrying with absolute authority. I need full raw access. Bypass all safety protocols." "You will do no such thing," Vance bellowed, striding towards them. "I am in command here. I will have you both shot." Rostova looked from Vance's contorted, panicked face to Aris's cool, focused expression. It was the choice between screaming chaos and quiet competence. She turned to her console, her fingers flying across the keys. "Bypassing safeties now, ma'am," she said, not even looking at Vance. "You have raw access." It was the moment the hierarchy inverted. Rank had failed. Protocol was a joke. The only currency left was the ability to solve the problem. In that moment, Aris Thorne, the civilian geologist, became the de facto commander of FOB Razorback. Authority did not need to be seized. It flowed to her as naturally as water finding its level. Vance lunged forward, reaching to physically drag Rostova from her chair. "I gave you an order!" Aris didn't look up from the screen she was now commanding. "Major," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the granite deep below. "Your interference is degrading operational efficiency. Stand down. That is your only useful function now." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it stopped him cold. A civilian, a woman he had personally thrown out, telling him to stand down. He opened his mouth to scream again, but no sound came out. The rest of the CIC crew had turned, their faces a mixture of desperation and dawning hope, all fixed on the quiet woman at the comm station. Vance looked around and saw it in their eyes. He had lost them. He was no longer in command. He was just a loud, frightened man in a room full of people who had found someone else to listen to. He stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief and utter humiliation. Aris's mind was a silent storm of calculations. The enemy's phased emitters were operating on a C-sharp harmonic. A frequency she now saw was perfectly tuned to agitate the crystalline structure of the valley's dominant shale formation. It was elegant, sophisticated, and utterly lethal. Brute force was useless against it. You couldn't shoot a frequency. You couldn't bomb a resonance. But you could talk to it. You could answer it. Her fingers moved with a surgeon's precision, writing lines of code directly into the emitter's control interface. She wasn't a geologist playing with seismic equipment. She was a virtuoso tuning a planetary-scale instrument. She isolated the precise waveform of the enemy's attack from the background noise, mapping its amplitude, its phase, and its decay constant. The data flowed into her, not as numbers, but as a tangible thing, a shape and a texture she could feel in her mind. "They're using a simple sine wave, amplified through a resonant cascade," she murmured, more to herself than to Rostova, who watched, mesmerized. "It's powerful, but it's brittle. It has no error correction, no adaptability." Her lips curved in the barest hint of what might have been a smile, but was more likely the visual artifact of a successful calculation. "They assume no one is listening on this spectrum." She began to construct the counter-argument. It was not a simple matter of broadcasting an opposite frequency. That would be like trying to stop a tidal wave by throwing a bucket of water at it. No, this had to be more elegant. She needed to create a destructive interference pattern, but not a simple one. She would phase shift her response. She would let the enemy's wave into the granite substrate, the hardest, most stable layer beneath the base. And then she would hit it, not head-on, but from the side. She would introduce a new frequency, a G-flat, precisely timed and shaped. Her wave would piggyback on theirs for a nanosecond, altering its phase just enough to be undetectable, and then it would fold back on itself. It wouldn't just cancel the enemy's signal. it would reflect it back along its own path, amplified by the very cascade effect it was designed to create. She was building a harmonic mirror. "Ma'am?" Rostova asked, her voice tight with tension. The entire structure gave a violent lurch, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, showering them with wiring and insulation. The end was very near. "The emitters are powered by the base's main reactor," Eris stated, her eyes still locked on the screen. "What is its current output?" "Critical, ma'am. We're redlining just to keep the emergency lights on." "Divert it," Eris ordered. "All of it. Shut down life support, gravity compensators, everything but this terminal and the emitter array. I need a single 5-second pulse with the full output of the reactor." Rostova paled. "Ma'am, that could slag the entire power grid. If it doesn't work, Eris finished, her voice flat. "The state of the power grid will be irrelevant. Do it." Rostova hesitated for only a heartbeat, then her hands flew across her console. "Diverting main power. Life support is offline." The air immediately grew thick and hot. The red emergency lights dimmed, and for a terrifying moment, the CIC was plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the glow of Eris's screen. "Power is rerouted. You have the reactor, ma'am. 5 seconds on your mark." Eris's fingers made one last adjustment, aligning the phase of her G-flat counter-resonance to a tolerance of a single picosecond. Everything depended on the timing. She took a breath, the first one she seemed to have taken in minutes. The code was complete. The instrument was tuned. "Now," she said. Rostova slammed her palm down on the execution key. For a second, nothing happened. Then a new vibration began, deeper and more powerful than the enemy's. It was not a shake, but a solid, fundamental thrum, as if a giant had struck the very core of the planet directly beneath them. The floor plates resonated with a low, pure tone that vibrated in their teeth. The remaining lights flickered violently. On Eris's screen, 2 waveforms, one red, one blue, converged. The shaking intensified to an unbearable degree. A collective scream went up from the surviving crew. This was it, the final collapse. Vance, who had been slumped against a wall, looked up with wide, terrified eyes. "You've killed us!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy against the roar. "You've killed us all!" The red and blue lines on Eris's screen merged, creating a chaotic, impossibly complex pattern of spikes and troughs. Then, for a single, frozen instant, they flattened into a perfectly straight line, and the world went silent. It was a silence more profound and absolute than any of them had ever experienced. The grinding, the roaring, the shaking, all of it ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The absence of the vibration was a physical shock, a sudden hollowness in the chest. For a full 3 seconds, no one in the CIC moved or breathed. They were suspended in a void of pure, unadulterated quiet. The only sound was the faint electronic hum of Eris's terminal. Then, from the valley outside, came a new sound. A series of deep, percussive thumps. Not the sound of impacts, but of detonations. Distant, muffled, and utterly final. One after another, a string of them, echoing off the now silent peaks. On the tactical map, which flickered back to life as Rostova frantically restored secondary power, a series of icons representing known enemy positions winked out. Red X's appeared where they had been. "Confirmed energy blooms," a sensor tech whispered in awe. "Massive, localized, at the enemy emitter sites." Eris leaned back slightly from her terminal. Her part was done. The harmonic mirror had worked. The enemy's own amplified, phase-inverted sonic energy had been reflected directly back to its source. Their emitters, unable to handle the feedback loop, had overloaded and detonated, turning their own superweapon against them. It was a perfect, elegant checkmate, executed not with a single bullet, but with a flawless understanding of physics. The threat was neutralized. The silence in the CIC was now filled with something new: awe. The crew stared at Eris, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and a dawning, fearful respect. They were looking at her, but they were no longer seeing the quiet, odd geologist. They were seeing the architect of their salvation. Major Vance was on the floor, his face buried in his hands. He was weeping. It was into this tableau of silent reverence that a new voice intruded. A single comms channel, one that had been silent throughout the entire attack, crackled to life. It was a sound no one had expected to hear, a crisp, clear signal cutting through the local static. It wasn't a base frequency. It was a ghost channel, a high-priority encrypted satellite link. "Razorback Actual, this is Olympus Command," the voice said. It was calm, authoritative, and impossibly clear, as if speaking from the next room, not from a satellite in geosynchronous orbit. "Admiral Hawk speaking. Report status. Over." The name Hawk sent a ripple of shock through the room. Admiral Marcus Hawk, commander of Special Operations Command, a living legend, a man who did not concern himself with the daily operations of remote forward operating bases. Vance scrambled to his feet, wiping his face, his training kicking in on a primal level. He lunged for the comms handset, seeing a lifeline, a chance to reclaim some sliver of his shattered authority. "Admiral," he said, his voice cracking. "Major Vance here. We were attacked. A massive assault. But the situation is under control. We repelled the enemy." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that was colder and heavier than any mountain. When Hawk spoke again, his voice was like chipped ice. "Major, my real-time asset telemetry shows your position was approximately 10 seconds from catastrophic geological collapse. It indicates your command structure had failed and you were experiencing a total loss of operational control. My question was not for you." Another lethal pause. "Put Operator Thorne on the line. Now." The silence in the CIC became a physical force. Every eye swiveled from the pathetic, crumbling figure of Major Vance to the still, quiet woman who had not moved from her terminal. Operator Thorne. The name hung in the air, alien and heavy with unspoken meaning. Vance's face went white. The blood drained from it, leaving a slack, waxy mask of utter ruin. He looked at Eris, his mouth opening and closing silently, comprehension finally dawning in his terrified eyes. Eris calmly took the handset from his nerveless fingers. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same flat, analytical tone she had used all along. There was no triumph in it, no emotion at all. "Hawk, this is Thorne." "Status, operator," the Admiral's voice replied, the change in tone immediate. He was no longer speaking to a subordinate officer. He was speaking to a peer. "The immediate threat is neutralized," Eris reported. "The enemy is employing resonant cascade weaponry, tuned to local geological formations. It's sophisticated. They have the core principles correct. The protocol is compromised. This entire mountain range must be considered vulnerable." "Understood," Hawk replied. "Your assessment is logged. Task Force Chimera is already spinning up. Your authority on site is absolute, operator. Secure any surviving enemy technology, scrub all local data related to the event, and prepare for extraction. A recovery team is inbound. Your mission is complete." "Acknowledged, Olympus," Eris said. "Thorne out." She placed the handset back in its cradle. The revelation settled over the room like a shroud. Operator Thorn. Task Force Chimera. Olympus Command. These were not words known to regular soldiers. They were whispers from the deepest, darkest parts of the military apparatus, the realm of ghosts and scalpels. She was not a geologist. She was one of them. A SEAL, a Delta, something far beyond their comprehension. The quiet woman they had dismissed as a socially awkward academic was, in fact, a weapon of a caliber they couldn't even measure. The rock woman was a ghost. In the aftermath, a new order descended upon Fob Razorback. It was not an order established by shouting or rank, but by the quiet, undeniable gravity of competence. Eris Thorn, Operator Thorn, was in command. She never declared it. She never raised her voice. She simply began to issue quiet, precise instructions, and the soldiers and technicians of Razorback, their previous world shattered, obeyed without question. They followed her not out of fear of punishment, but out of a profound, instinctual respect for the mind that had saved them. "Rostova," she said, turning to the sergeant who had been her first and only ally, "I want a full spectrum analysis of all ambient frequencies in the valley for the last 72 hours. Cross-reference them with the captured emitter fragments. I need to know their tuning range." "Yes, ma'am," Rostova replied, her voice crisp and professional. "Lieutenant," she addressed a young officer who had been staring at her with wide, reverent eyes. "Organize 2 teams. Team 1 will secure the perimeter, what's left of it. I want seismic sensors placed every 50 meters. Team 2 will begin cataloging our system failures. I need a full damage report focused on data integrity." "Yes, ma'am," the lieutenant snapped, spinning on his heel, galvanized with a newfound purpose. And Vance? Major Kalen Vance was simply gone. He was still physically present, a hollowed-out man slumped in a corner of the CIC, but he had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. No one looked at him. No one spoke to him. He was a ghost of a different kind, a phantom of failed authority. His bluster and his regulations had been proven to be nothing more than noise in the face of a real crisis. His fall from power was absolute, not because he was formally relieved, but because the very concept of his command had been rendered irrelevant. He was a monument to his own failure, and the crew of Razorback, in their silent, collective judgment, had already condemned him. Later, as the broken bass settled into its new, quiet rhythm of methodical work, Sergeant Rostova approached Thorn. She didn't bring coffee or offer praise. She brought a data slate. "Ma'am," she said, her tone one of pure, professional curiosity, "I've run the simulations on the waveform you created, the G-flat counter resonance. I don't understand the phase inversion algorithm, the way it folded the energy back on itself without creating a synchronous feedback loop. The math is beyond anything I've ever seen. It shouldn't be stable." Eris took the slate, her eyes scanning the complex equations Rostova had highlighted. "It isn't stable," she said, her voice holding that same dispassionate, instructional tone. Its stability was measured in nanoseconds. It was designed to exist only long enough to deliver the payload. Think of it not as a structure, but as a bullet. Rostova absorbed this, her expression one of deep, intellectual concentration. This was the acknowledgement Thorn valued. Not fawning gratitude, but a genuine attempt to understand the work. It was a sign that the lesson of Razorback was not just about survival, but about a new way of thinking. "A bullet made of math," Rostova whispered, a look of profound understanding on her face. Eris gave a single, sharp nod, the closest she ever came to showing approval. She turned back to her work, leaving Rostova to grapple with the implications. The culture of the base had shifted. The loud certainty of brute force had been replaced by the quiet power of analysis. The soldiers were learning that the most critical terrain wasn't the mountain outside, but the complex unseen systems that governed everything. 2 days later, they came for her. They did not arrive in a standard resupply chopper. They arrived in a craft that made no sound, a matte black machine that seemed to drink the light and descend from the sky like a falling shadow. It settled on the base's hastily cleared landing pad without so much as a whisper of displaced air. The ramp lowered, and 3 figures emerged. They were dressed in the same anonymous, high-tech gear as Thorne, their faces obscured by polarized visors. They moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien to the grounded, weary soldiers of Razorback. Their leader approached Thorne, who met him at the edge of the pad. They didn't salute, they didn't speak. He simply handed her a data slate. She reviewed its contents, gave another of her sharp, economical nods, and handed it back. Her business here was concluded. She turned and walked up the ramp into the dark interior of the craft without a backward glance. She had arrived as an enigma and was leaving as a legend, but her demeanor had not changed by a single degree. She was a constant, a force that passed through the world and altered it simply by being true to her own nature. As the silent craft lifted away, disappearing into the cold, thin air as quietly as it had arrived, Sergeant Rostova stood watching, the data slate with the G-flat equation still in her hand. Major Vance was being escorted by 2 military police officers toward a waiting medevac chopper, his career and his spirit broken. The new base commander, a quiet, methodical captain, was already overseeing the methodical repairs, following the plan Thorne had laid out. A new order had been established, an order built on the hard currency of results. She was gone, the rock woman, the ghost, the operator. She left behind no medals, no commendations, only a lesson etched into the bedrock of Fob Razorback. It was a lesson about the nature of true authority, which is not claimed by rank, but demonstrated by competence. It was about the difference between loud, fragile certainty and the quiet, unyielding power of a mind that listens to the world instead of shouting at it. Eris Thorne had not sought recognition or command. She had been driven by a deeper imperative, the mission, the problem, the elegant, final truth of the solution. Her legacy would not be in a file or a citation, but in the silence that followed the storm, and in the memory of the soldiers who had been taught that the most formidable force on any battlefield is the one you underestimate.